she just put it in the machine to print and came out with this. So essentially, it was my fault. But it was, I take back what I said. It was not a plan. Just a botch up.
The machine's fault.
No, it's not the machine's fault. My wife was a computer programmer, and what she used to say, what most of these people who worked in programming used to say was, garbage in, garbage out. In other words, it's what you put in the machine just does what it's told. So if you get something stupid out, it's probably because you put something stupid in. So, anyway, during these sessions, these 6 weeks, we're in the 3rd week of this phase of our extremely long class. We're doing we're looking at the things that were happening in the time of the Romans. In particular, we've already looked at, before Christmas week, had some sessions in which we looked at the Roman governors, Pontius Pilate, the way Jesus was treated, and so on. And now we're looking at, as it says here on your paper, the era of the apostles and early church. Now, I think you can imagine that what that really basically means is the period from after Jesus, which would be somewhere around our calendar AD 30, to almost the end of the 1st century, about 65 years. It says here, problems of the first generation. It was the problems of the first generation, but also probably of the 2nd generation of people who were followers of Jesus. The sources that I talked about are almost entirely in the New Testament. As you well know, what we know about Jesus' life and ministry is primarily presented to us in the 4 Gospels. The rest of what's called the New Testament, which includes a battery of letters, plus one very odd book called the Apocalypse or Revelation. Those books all have to do with what was happening and did happen after Jesus' life and ministry. In other words, in the time that his followers carried on, and this is exactly what Luke says in the very first verses of his Acts of the Apostles, which I'll read. He says, and I can find it. I think it. Yeah.
Page 6.
Oh, it's on page 6?
Is it
Good.
right here, page 2?
Page 2, I think. Yeah. Yeah, in the middle of the page, he says, in the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began. Notice the wording is very intentional. What Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up. The way he says it indicates that he regards the work of Jesus as still going on, even though Jesus is not bodily present. His work began in the gospel, it continued in the life of the apostles after giving instruction through the Holy Spirit. So what he says is that he is about to tell us in the Acts of the Apostles what happened after Jesus was not with them. Now, this period of time, I think instead of giving you actual dates, I think it would be accurate to say that it covered the entire period until the last living member of the 12 actually died. And that person was John. And he lived until the reign of the Emperor Trajan, which is somewhere around 98 to 100 AD. Now you may be aware that John, the brother of James, was the disciple that Jesus loved, the disciple that leaned on his breast and that was right next to him at the Last Supper and so on. And he was at the cross, at the foot of the cross when Jesus was being crucified. John must well have been the youngest of the 12 apostles, and we can only guess at his age, but it must have been in his late teens. So he was a good 10 or 12 years younger than Jesus. And he lived the longest, and when he died a natural death, he was quite an old person. I should say a few words about longevity. This has nothing to do with the New Testament or the course. It's an ancient history fact. Many times people publish books that tell about how short the life expectancy was in antiquity or in the Middle Ages or in the 18th century. And those statistics should be observed with considerable care because they can be very misleading. The inference is that the vast majority of people died much younger than people do now. And that there would never be such a thing as a room full of us octogenarians and nonagenarian people around, because that didn't happen. Well, that is wrong. There were many people in antiquity who lived to very ripe old ages. Sophocles, who wrote the great tragedies, lived to 95. And the Apostle John seems to have lived until he was about 98. The Gospel writer Mark lived to 84 years old. So why are these statistics there? There's a very simple answer, and you probably already know what it is. Infant mortality. Huge numbers of children never got out of their childhood. They died of childhood diseases, many of them. Diseases that have been more or less wiped out in our society. And we don't expect children to die when they're less than 5 years old. But if you were to collect all of the tombstones, the thousands and thousands of tombstones that were erected by the Romans, and read them all, if you could read Greek and Latin, you would discover that there were an enormous number of dead children. And this, of course, is what really makes it seem like the life expectancy is somewhere, you know, like if they tell you, oh, the life expectancy was 47 years old. Well, that doesn't mean that most people lived to 47 and then pass away. It means that lots of children died and then some of the others lived to be 80 and 90. And that's what happened. So the Apostle John lived to a very ripe old age and died a natural death. And so between the time that Jesus ascended, as Luke refers to it, and the death of John, that would sort of constitute the age of the apostles, because he was the last of the 12 to be alive. And that would be something on the order of just under 70 years. That's a good long time. Now, the information that we have about that period, at least for the earliest part, is primarily from the parts of the New Testament that are Acts of the Apostles and those letters. Those are the places where we learn most about what was going on in the first generation, the Apostles' generation. And so that means that the Acts of the Apostles is not only a book for religious and spiritual instruction, but it is also a major historical source of what was going on. So page 1, which is actually attached to the front of the packet. I've tried to call your attention to this. The Acts of the Apostles that we have is 28 chapters in length. I should point out something else that maybe you're not aware of. All of the divisions of our Bible into chapters and verses is entirely modern, and it did not exist in the Old Testament, in the New Testament times, or in the Middle Ages for that matter. It's something completely modern. So it's a very handy reference source. That's why people at football games can hold up a little sign that says John 3:16, and 2/3 of the world know exactly what he's telling you. But those numbers were not used in antiquity. In ancient times, Acts of the Apostles by Luke was just a big scroll written out line by line for I don't know, about 20 pages or however much it takes in your Bible.
So when did they create the verses?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. But I know it's not anywhere near as old as the books themselves. But of course, it's very useful for us to find things. The Acts of the Apostles in our Bible is 28 pages long, and it tells primarily in the early stages what was going on in and around Jerusalem, especially with the disciples who were still in Jerusalem, almost all of whom were Jewish. They were natives of Jerusalem and the region near and around Jerusalem, and from Galilee, where Jesus did his ministry, and it was almost all Jewish people. And the information that's given in the Gospels about the apostles' activities are mainly about Peter, and he's probably the main character of them all. As you get down towards the middle of the Acts of the Apostles, you begin to run into the stories about Paul. And then the last half of the book has an enormous amount about Paul. in great detail, and it carries Paul to the point where he is transported by ship under Roman guards to Rome to be given a hearing in the court of Caesar. And suddenly the book ends, and it doesn't tell us anything about what happened. And we don't know. From that source, we don't know anything about what happened to the end of Paul or to the end of Peter. Now, in those 28 chapters, I've broken this down for the sake of thinking. It seems like these are the biggest problems that Luke is showing us. Number one, the standing of the disciples before hostile authorities. Repeatedly, chapter after chapter, Peter is being arrested, he's being thrown in jail, he's getting out of jail, he's being arrested again, he's being flogged, he's, so the authorities are hostile to him. Some of those authorities are Jewish institutions, the Council of Elders, this called the Sanhedrin, and some of them are Roman governors. There are stories of arrests, of jailings, of beatings, and of death, executions. And one of the questions about the Romans is just how well, I hope to try to give you some clues about this later, just how well did Romans, these people who came from Italy to govern the Jewish nation, just how well did they really understand Jews, and how well did they understand this new way, the Christian way? And the answer to that is complicated because the sources suggest that they were very confused and at first could not tell the difference between Christians, whether Jewish or Gentile, and practicing Jews. They were befuddled, and of course, as time went on, they began to discriminate between Jews who were practicing Jews and Christians, whether they were Jewish or Christians, and then they had to try to figure out how to deal with these different groups. It was very complicated because for a long time, the Jewish people had certain protections of their religious practices by the Roman government. So the question was going to arise, did these Christians still have these same protections or not? It was like whether you're arguing about a constitutional issue. So anyway, that's the first problem that you see over and over in Acts, is the dealing with hostile authorities. The second problem was internal, resolving their own problems. And one of the biggest ones is, how Jewish is the new faith supposed to be? And it was not immediately obvious, especially since the original, our first believers were almost all Jews. But to complicate that, the Jewish people themselves in the time of Jesus were immensely divided themselves about what was the right way for Judaism. Just as today we have Reform, Orthodox, traditional Jewish practices, in the time of Jesus and after, there were different levels of opinion about how rigorously the law should be followed and how the law should be rightly followed. So all the arguments that went on within Judaism now got incorporated into the problems of the early Christians. And as you can see in chapter 15 of Acts, they had to have a huge meeting of all the most important apostles in Jerusalem, Acts chapter 15, in order to decide some of these questions. One of the big questions was, if a person is a Gentile and they become a believer, do they have to be circumcised? Big question when you're an adult. And so, and this is the question that the Christians were dealing with. How should Gentile disciples act? How much should they be following the law of Moses, or were they somehow exempt? These are conundrums for the early Christians, and they were in some ways also already, there were some conundrums that they already inherited from their Jewish heritage, which is, how does one relate to the law? You know, I just pause, that causes me to think about a little footnote here. You can remember the story of Matthew being called, and Jesus went to his house for a meal. And after the meal, when they came out, it says the Pharisees and their followers, they asked the disciples, the apostles, why does your master eat with publicans and sinners? In other words, why is he in Matthew's house associating with these people who are not properly practicing the laws in the Torah? So you can see that although Matthew was a Jew, that he was on the bad list of the Pharisees for not being a proper Jew, a good practicing Jew. And Jesus was now being tarred with the same brush because he was associating with these people who didn't keep the law properly. So this is a second thing you find throughout the Acts of the Apostles, are these endless discussions within the Christian church, the believers, about how Jewish they were supposed to be. And of course this problem got more and more complicated the more Gentiles came along. And so this is an issue that was going to grow rather than diminish. Now the third thing that you will observe is that one of the problems they had was to try to figure out who Jesus really was. Now they all agreed that Jesus was a person. And as John in one of his letters says, that which we have seen and heard and touched with our hands, that is what we bear witness to. And you remember when, after his resurrection, when he met the apostles and Thomas doubted, and they brought Thomas and he said, reach out your hand and put it in my side, and put your finger in my hands and see that I am not a spirit. I'm a real person. And so the question, however, doesn't get easier when you accept that part of it. I think everybody accepts that Jesus was a real person. That, you know, his feet got dirty when he walked around in sandals and things like this. But the question is, what was his connection to God? how were he and God related to each other? What are we supposed to understand with our minds about who Jesus is in relation to God? And this is a question of our beliefs, and it involves what's called theology, which is trying to understand God. And the biggest problem with this is, I'm speaking, this is a personal testimony here. The biggest problem with this issue is that it's impossible. There is no way that we can understand God. We won't understand him no matter how many books we read or how many philosophies we look at or how long we sit and ponder over it. And people much smarter than we are have already done that for centuries, and they're still befuddled. And I always, when people talk to me about theology, I mean, one of my colleagues who lives over there, he taught theology at St. Louis University. And I say to him, I said, what a hopeless assignment. I said, my conception of theology is like the story of 5 blind men standing around an elephant, and each one is trying to explain what the elephant was like. Have you ever heard this story? Well, the message there is clear. The blind guys can never get the full picture of the elephant, no matter how hard they try. Everything that they find out may be completely true, but it doesn't do the job. It doesn't ever reach to the point where they can tell you what an elephant is, because what they're going to tell you is just a pathetic, feeble experience that they can get. And so, I mean, I'm just, when you read the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul, you find out that half the letters of Paul are trying to explain to people what they ought to believe about Jesus and God, and what they shouldn't believe about Jesus and God, and it's very difficult. So, you know, so just being smart and having a lot of words doesn't necessarily do the trick. Now, if you'd like to, if it's not too much of a strain, go to page 2, which is the second page in the text. Sure.
I might have gotten something wrong here.
Yes?
You said the 2 apostles that were in trouble the most was Peter and, is it Peter and John?
Oh, well, no, not John. I just meant, the one I mentioned was Peter.
Right.
The second half of the Acts of the Apostles, it was Paul that was always getting in trouble.
Okay. Sorry.
Now, of course, there are a few others who get in trouble. I think we mentioned the other day, a couple of times back, Stephen, and he got in plenty of trouble. And before Christmas, we talked about James the Just, who was the brother of Jesus, and he was a very influential person who's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, and who was thrown off of the temple roof and stoned, but his death is not referred to in Acts of the Apostles. It's only referred to in outside sources. But all of these people were experiencing problems. Now I'm going to try to talk to you about the gospel writer Luke, starting on page 2. Let's start with Luke's own words, the beginning of his gospel. Chapter 1. Many have undertaken to compile narratives about the events that have been fulfilled among us. just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Now, these are very revealing statements from a historical point of view. He's telling you right off the bat, I was not one of the apostles of the 12, and I received all this from those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord. So he's telling you that he's, quote, a secondhand source in that sense. But the other thing he's telling us is that a whole lot of people had tried to write down what Jesus said and did, and these documents don't exist anymore. So we should never assume that, and sometimes people who study these things in seminaries, they talk as if they're dealing with the only documents there are. And they are dealing with the only documents there are, but this man is telling us that he had a lot of other documents. He was not the first, and he not only had the eyewitness testimonials of people who were eyewitnesses, but he also had the books of people who had tried to write things about Jesus before him, all of which are lost to us. I too decided, as one having a grasp of everything from the start, to write a well-ordered account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may have a firm grasp of the words in which you have been instructed. So he's addressing this book to someone of considerable importance. This person is probably a government official of some sort, because this is inferred from the words most excellent, which is like the honorable. It's a title of someone who held some sort of office. Next, the question of the man's name. His name is a Greek name, and it means friend of God. And it's not clear that this was the person's real name. It may have been a pseudonym. And if it was a pseudonym, it would probably mean that Luke was dedicating this book to a Christian man who was in a high position, and he's not willing to divulge the man's real name because it might do jeopardy, cause him to lose his job or be jailed or any number of bad things. And we can't know whether this was the man's actual name or whether this was a name that he gave this person to say, I know who you are. You are a Greek-speaking person who is a friend of God. And he says, and so that you may have a firm grasp of the words in which you have been instructed. So this man was a person who had been taught from somebody about Jesus and his ministry. And he had become a believer through the testimony of somebody else. And Luke is now dedicating this book to him and saying, I want you to have a good account that's set in good order, because a lot of people have tried to write about this, and you might find some of this confusing. So I'll straighten you out. So this is Luke's mission. Now we read the rest of his gospel, on and on and on. It comes to an end. And then we open the next thing, and it's Acts of the Apostles. And lo and behold, here's the first line. In the first book Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. And then he launches into his narrative, the Acts of the Apostles. Now, other information that we know about Luke is entirely snipped out of comments from Paul's letters, usually from either the greetings or the closing salutations at the end of the letter. For example, at the end of Colossians, the letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 14, he writes these words: Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. I should point out that many of these letters that Paul wrote, he wrote while he was in prison, almost certainly in Rome, and sent them out to groups of people who were the churches, and also to individuals. Timothy and Titus and Philemon were individuals, and these letters, the majority of the letters actually came from prison. You could probably have a book called Letters from Prison. And he says, my fellow prisoner greets you. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Now this implies that Luke was wherever Paul was, which we believe was Rome. And we learn now the first and only time that he was a physician. And most people surmise that he was Paul's personal physician, and that's why he called him the beloved physician. Well, he could have called him that anyway, but he very likely was Paul's physician. We know that Paul had some trouble, and most people have figured out that Paul had very bad eyesight. And the way that this is figured out is that one of his letters, he wrote his own name at the end of the letter and says, see with what large letters I write with my own hand. Now we infer from this that he normally didn't write his name. Somebody took down the letters for him, and he didn't necessarily sign them in person, but this letter he had signed in person, and he wants the guy to know that it was his signature, and so he tells him what large letters it was, and we have inferred from this that his eyesight was bad, and that's the only way he could write his name was quite big. I share with him not from the eyesight problem, but because I can't. My hand trembles too much to write things small. Anyway, Luke was the beloved physician. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters in Laodicea, and to Nympha and the church in her house. I include these words because for several reasons. One is there were, so far as we know, there were no church buildings in this first generation. The church did not have specific set buildings. They met in mostly in people's homes. And there are many, many references in the New Testament, in Paul's letters and elsewhere, to meeting in homes and whose home they were in. And this was, I'm pretty sure that when Christians traveled from place to place, that this is the way they found the congregations. They said, oh, you come into a certain place, to Colossae, and you ask for the house of Nympha, and then that's how you find out where the church is. So in Acts of the Apostles, when Peter and whoever was with him get out of jail, they go to meet the Christians, and they're at the house of Mary, where all the Christians are gathered and pray. So you see this over and over, that there are references to the church that meets in this house or that house. It's not the only place that they met, however. In one place, it describes Paul giving a sermon to a very crowded group, and it says that he was in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This was in the city of Troas, and so the church must have either owned this lecture hall or rented it. This is the famous story where a young man was sitting in the window listening to Paul's sermon, and he fell asleep and fell out the window. Let that be a warning. So anyway, the 2 Timothy chapter 4 says, "Do your best to come to me soon. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me." Now head to the 4th page, which is page 3. And he says, this is a continuation, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in the ministry. I have sent Tychicus to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and also the books, and above all, the parchments." Now, books are actually scrolls. So he has apparently 2 kinds of written material. He has papyrus scrolls, and he has also parchments. The parchments were made out of tanned leather, which is scraped very thin and fine. Papyrus, of course, is made from the reeds that grow in Egypt, and that was the most widely used ancient writing paper. In any case, he's got a cloak and book and scrolls and parchments, and he wants the person to bring them. I'd like to mention that if you look at the names of all these places, take a look at the titles of the letters. Letters to the Galatians. Where is Galatia? It's a district in the central part of Turkey. And then Ephesus, a major city on the western coast of Turkey near the Aegean Sea. Colossae, another major city on the western coast of Asia Minor or Turkey. Laodicea, another place near that. He mentions Smyrna. All of these places were, by the time that Paul was in 62 or 63 AD, Paul was in Rome and writing, and there were churches in all these towns. And almost all of, not everyone, but lots of these churches had many Gentiles in them. Now, to give you an example of how the fact that Luke was himself not a Jew, but he's called in one place a proselyte from Antioch. A proselyte means he was a Gentile who had been converted to Judaism and then again converted to be a disciple of Jesus. It is only in his gospel that we find these very favorable things that Jesus said and did for and with Samaritans. The Samaritans were in a very hostile relationship with the Jews. And they had a long history of bigotry and dislike. You can read about that in the Gospels. John, in his Gospel, tells a story about the woman who went to the well, and she was a Samaritan. She had a big discussion with Jesus. She says, our fathers taught us that this is the mountain where we should worship God, not Jerusalem. And she went on and on like this. And people have pointed out that the story of the Good Samaritan is terribly, terribly revealing, because a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was passing through the hills on his way down to the Jordan Valley, and he got waylaid by bandits, and he got beaten badly, and all his stuff was stolen. And then the people started to come by down the road, and they wouldn't stop to help him. But finally this man came with a donkey, and it was a Samaritan. And I mean, you might as well say he was a Somali from Minneapolis. And he stopped, and he came off the road, and he washed the wounds, and he bandaged them up, and he put the pathetic fellow on his donkey, and he took him to the nearest town, maybe that was Jericho, and he took him to an inn, and he asked the innkeeper to give him a bed, and he paid the bill. And Jesus says, who was it that was the neighbor to this man? And the answer, of course, is the Samaritan, the hated person, the one that everybody thought was an untouchable, sort of. That's the one who actually did the right thing. Well, Jesus tells this story in Luke. And Jesus also praises the faith of Gentiles who are mentioned in the scriptures of the Old Testament, who are Gentiles, like the widow of Zarephath, who helped the prophet Elijah, and Naaman the Syrian, who came to the prophet Elijah appealing for his help. So he deliberately mentions Gentiles. And then there's a story about the 10 lepers that Jesus cured, and they all went away to make their proper sacrifices, but one came back and fell at Jesus' feet and thanked him profusely for saving him from leprosy, and he was the Samaritan. So Luke is delivering a clear message here that Jesus has made it clear that Samaritans are not to be rejected and cast out. They are to be understood and accepted. This is part of, well, he's the only Gentile writing a gospel. Now, Origen of Alexandria was one of the great, enormously educated Christian fathers who flourished around 240 to 250 AD. This is 200 years after this, and he produced a vast amount of material, including a huge number of sermons. And this passage that I'm about to read was from a sermon that was written about, in which Origen was preaching about Luke. And this is the text of the sermon. He says, there have been written down not only the 4 Gospels, but a whole series. Luke's preface runs thus: "For as much as many have taken in hand to compose a narrative." And then Origen comments, "The expression 'they have taken in hand' implies those who precipitately and without the grace of the Holy Spirit set about writing of the Gospels." In other words, Origen thinks that those people who just wrote down some stuff were not doing it thoughtfully or in the Spirit, with the help of the Holy Spirit. Matthew, to be sure, and Mark and John, as well as Luke, did not take in hand to write, but filled with the Holy Spirit have written the Gospels. Quote, "Many have taken in hand to compose a narrative of the events which are quite definitely familiar among us." Then he concludes this way: "The church," that is, the Christians as he knows them in his day, "possesses 4 Gospels. Heresy, a great many, one of which is entitled the Gospel according to the Egyptians, and another, the Gospel according to the 12 Apostles." Well, he's clearly telling us these are not real legit Gospels at all. And last time I gave you some examples of sayings from the Gospel of Thomas. We would only know about this because of papyri that have been found in the desert in Egypt. But here we see from Origen that what we also know, I mean, if you go and look at scholarly literature, you'll find out there are many other Gospels. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of Mary, there are all sorts of strange Gospels. And Origen is simply saying, nope, none of those. He said those are the ones that we don't have anything to do with. Yes?
What date would this be, this writing?
About 250 in Alexandria, Egypt. Now,
So by then they had decided those 4 were the ones.
yeah, and they apparently had decided it very long before that.
I see.
Um, Here's an example, the Muratorian fragment. This starts on page 4, which is page 3, and goes to page 3, which is page 4. The Muratorian fragment is one of the more interesting documents of Christian history. It's a medieval document that was written sometime in the Middle Ages, in the 8th century, the 700s AD, and it was in a library in northern Italy that was apparently a library that was inherited from the famous Christian bishop Ambrose of Milan, who lived around 450 AD and was a very learned man himself. And he left a big library, and in that library, this Italian scholar, whose name was Muratori, you see his dates there, in 1740, discovered a Latin catalog of the New Testament writings with accompanying comments. And he published a text, which scholars have subsequently called the Canon of Muratori, naming it after the man who found it in the monastery library. It's called a fragment because the beginning of it is missing. The 3 dots that I show you on this paper are actual because this is where the fragment begins. And it's pretty evident that the fragment originally talked about the first gospel and the second gospel, and the only part we have left is these words. The third gospel book is that according to Luke. This physician Luke, after Christ's ascension, since Paul had taken him with him as an expert in the way, composed it in his own name according to his own plan. Yet he himself did not see the Lord in the flesh. Therefore he was able to ascertain it. As he was able to ascertain it, he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. So the person, the anonymous person who composed this fragment, and it presumably was composed in the late Roman period, has made these comments about the book of Luke, attributing it to a physician, and that the physician was a close associate of Paul, and he did it in his own name, and he was not an eyewitness of the Lord in the flesh, and so on. Now, last of all, my last presentation about Luke is from Eusebius, The History of the Church, published almost exactly AD 400 in Caesarea, Palestine. And Eusebius, in his History of the Church, scroll number 3, has these words. Luke, who was of a family from Antioch and a physician by profession, and who was especially intimate with Paul and well acquainted with the rest of the apostles, has left us 2 inspired books showing the spiritual healing art which he learned from them. Eusebius, being a clever fellow, is making a play on Luke's profession as a physician. As a physician, he knows the physical healing arts, but the spiritual healing arts he learned from others. One of these books is his gospel. He testified that he wrote as those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered to him, all of whom, he says, he followed accurately from the first. The other book is the Acts, pardon the spelling there, scratch out the A, of the apostles, which he composed not from the accounts of others, but from what he had seen himself. Now, I pause to mention one thing about the Acts of the Apostles. If you read the whole book from start to finish, or especially the last half, start with chapter 16, almost the entire last half of the Acts is about Paul. And in that narrative, he says, Paul went here, and Paul went there, and Paul said this, and Paul did that. And then all of a sudden, in chapter 23, when he starts describing the ship and the Roman soldiers taking Paul to Rome, he starts saying, we went here and we went there. And throughout the story of the ship voyage and the shipwreck, the pronoun we is used constantly. All people who have studied the Acts of the Apostles have seen immediately that this means that Luke was personally present from the time that Paul left Caesarea on that ship with the Roman soldiers all the way to Rome. And we've seen from the letters that Paul said that Luke was there in Rome with him. So we get from the Acts of the Apostles, there's no place where he says, oh, and this is where I joined him. But you can tell by the narrative that it is true that that was where he joined them. That means that Luke was one of those people who was on that ship when the storm smashed it and when all the people had to swim for their lives to the beach. Luke was one of those who swam for his life to the beach along with the rest. And so, so this is why the book of Acts has this shift from they did this and he did that to we. And they say that Paul meant, some people say, I guess, I don't know who he means by they, say that Paul meant to refer to Luke's gospel whenever, as if speaking of some gospel of his own, he used the words, according to my gospel. Now, whether that's really true or not, I don't know. Maybe according to my gospel just means the way I told the story about it. But then that may be the same thing, because he was probably one of the primary sources for Luke. However, Luke, as we've already seen, was in personal contact at some time or other with other of the eyewitness apostles. So he was not an apostle himself, but he was closely tied to them, had good source material, some of it written, and some of it not very good source material. And he composed the work that we have now, these two works. And now you can unstaple it and put it back in the correct order. This session is over. Any questions, comments, observations?
Which is Luke?
What?
Which is Luke? Is he the human of the four things?
He's the ox.
He's the ox.
And I still don't know why those assignments were made.
I have a question about the Samaritans. Do you know, they've been